Thanks everyone. We're going to get into Fisheries Policy 101. After this, Austin is going to walk around with a little wireless mic, and if anyone has any questions, you can ask Willie or myself, and we'll try to answer them for you. And that goes into, you can ask questions about the previous presentation as well. Thank you, buddy. So, Fisheries Policy 101. Basically, two parts to this. We want to educate our guides, businesses, and anglers on fisheries policy and provide them knowledge and strategies needed to be an effective advocate. So that is a heavy lift. That is not something that we can do in an hour sitting here. I think the goal of this talk is to encourage people to connect with us more post this meeting, so we can go through the continual process of getting people up to speed on fisheries policy. Willie mentioned previously that he was assigned. Well, he worked for Senator Markey's office. Your senator, from everyone who lives in Massachusetts, worked in Senator Markey's office. Obviously, specialized in fisheries, and he's going to be able to kind of provide a totally different perspective on fisheries policy because he was on the other side of the table. So, you want to add anything to this? You want to burn through the next slide?
Yeah, I think we can probably keep going, Tony, and I can provide some
sure.
Some examples later on.
So we put this quote up from Marty Gary, who is a dear friend of mine, and he is the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission striped bass chair and the executive director of the Potomac Rivers Fisheries Commission. And I don't have to read the quote, but basically what it says is we made a difference at that meeting in May, and when the future of striped bass was on the line, the commissioners were compelled to lean heavily on the side of conservation because of the outpouring of comments in the process. So I actually wrote the first one, like, without advocates, there is no future. Because if you're not there on the ground telling them what you want, they don't know. They have no idea. Because trust me, there are other people there telling them things that you might not want or think that the best for the future. And you have to be in the arena. You have to be in the fight if you love this. Your voice matters. We hear constantly every day that, oh, I want this, I want that. They never listen. What's the point? Well, I think on May 4th, we found out that striped bass do have a future, and it was because the voice was heard. So I hope and pray that, besides striped bass being on the right trajectory now, the other thing that I would hope that people get from this is that it pays to be involved. I don't ever want to hear again, my voice doesn't matter, because it fundamentally made a change in the way that striped bass are going to be managed, and we're going to see positive results from this in the future. And it was because the voice was heard. That is no longer a valid argument. Your voice was heard.
Yeah, so I put this idea of, is this an angler obligation or not? And I know, Tony, we've talked about how fisheries conservation is a tradition. It's part of being a fisherman for a lot of folks in this country and elsewhere. And I know we've talked with Peter Jenkins, our board chair, who really views conservation as an investment in his business, right? And the long-term benefit of the long-term sustainability of your business. And I think this is just kind of something to think about. Like, if you want to see a strong fishery into the future, is it not maybe your obligation or something you should really think about in terms of becoming involved in the process and learning the process, and fully aware that this is complex stuff, and there's a pretty steep learning curve, and we obviously try to help where we can there to smooth that out and get folks involved. But I think if you really do care about keeping this fishery around into the future, it's really important to be engaged, not just on the water but off the water as well.
We feel a very deep obligation to our members and the people that we represent. And, through this process, that was absolutely front of mind in everything that we did. I would talk to Jamie Boyle, our board member from Massachusetts, and you'd hear his little boy Tyler running around in the background, and he loves Legos. He loves to fish with his dad. He loves all of these things. That's our obligation. That's what we're fighting for. I want to ensure that Jamie can do this, provide for his family. He works his tail off. But from a personal perspective, each one of the anglers, when you're out there at night and it's just so beautiful and the moon's hitting the water and it's a way to unplug from the day-to-day stress and all those things, like I say it all the time, isn't there an obligation to give back to that? If you love it that much, fight for it. And you wonder. I use the analogy. You go to a movie theater and somebody left their popcorn or their soda and they just left it a mess, and it kind of ruins your experience if you're bringing your kids or your family to see the latest kids movie. And like, don't you have an obligation as just a person on this planet to leave things nice for it's the same thing when you're out there, whether you're hunting, whether you're fishing, whether you're hiking, biking, whatever. We have an obligation at this point in the game to leave things better than we found it. And as we said, with wind, with aquaculture, with the angling community growing, the issues are increasing. And if we don't individually step up and take responsibility for that, we're going to be in a really bad place soon. So that's was my goal of the slide. Did I leave anything out? Oh, Will, next slide, please. So Willie, if you want to talk about the federal fisheries framework, because Willie's kind of seen both sides of it, and I think he'd probably be a little bit better at it.
We're just going to give a 30,000 foot view of kind of the two general spheres of our work, one being at the federal level and one being at the interstate level. And so first off, at the federal level, our kind of guiding document here is the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which was passed originally in 1976, and this governs fisheries management in all federal waters, which is generally from 3 to 200 miles offshore. So this is not, your striped bass, red drum. This is more your red snapper, mahi-mahi, cod and haddock, those types of fisheries. And the way that it works is MSA established 8 regional management councils around the country. The two that we work with most at ASGA that are most relevant here are the New England Fishery Management Council and the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council. These, have voting members on them that are nominated by governors and then approved by the Department of Commerce. And so we're, actively involved in that process. And again, those are kind of where a lot of the authority for management lies. And what those councils do is their voting members approve management strategies or management approaches that are in line with what the Magnuson-Stevens Act requires. And then those management proposals go to the Department of Commerce and the National Marine Fisheries Service for ultimate approval. And
I might add, because this is Fisheries Policy 101, if anyone's interested in participating, on a little bit of a higher level with fisheries policies, it's not a tremendous lift. It doesn't take a lot of time, but each one of these councils or even the commission has advisory panels on each species that they manage, and they're always looking for people to be on these advisory panels. And in this day and age, it's basically just, a conference call once a month for an hour, and we can help you get on those advisory panels, write letters of support, help you put the forums together, because that is the track for an angler to take that step from like, okay, I kind of understand this, I'm going to write a letter, and you're like, wait a minute, I really care about bluefish. I want to be on the advisory panel so I can advise the council members or the commission members on my feelings on bluefish. And it's not a heavy lift, but that's how you start like working your way up the ladder of participation. And a few years down the line, the next thing you know, you are a council member or a commission member, and you're sitting at that table voting on these really hard decisions. So there's a way that you could sit here and sit at this table and not know anything in fisheries policy, and in 2 years be on an advisory panel, and in 4 years be a council member. This is a public process, and there are ways to get involved. So.
Yeah, that's a great thing to point out, is that this is a process that everybody in this room can be a part of, and I think a lot of people in this room have been a part of, which is great. And I'm not going to go into great detail on everything that's in MSA. We do have experts in the room if you want to find out more, but basically this document this piece of legislation has some key elements that have been responsible for really sustainably managing a lot of our fisheries, particularly since some reauthorizations of the original law in 1996 and 2006. Some of these elements include, the need to adhere to the best available science in making all of your decisions. That's a pretty core requirement that I think is important for making sure we're basing our decisions on what we know. The idea of having hard catch limits, so having a hard poundage annual catch limit that you can't exceed, and then requiring fisheries or fishery sectors to be held accountable if they do exceed that. Now, again, recreational fisheries are tricky because the data are not available in real time. As we were talking about earlier, data collection continues to be a challenge with recreational fisheries, but that doesn't mean that the fishery doesn't need to be held accountable, and that we need to think about what's being harvested on our side. And those are some of the questions that we're continuing to wrestle with and try to figure out solutions for. And then one other key tenet here is the idea of strict rebuilding timelines. So generally, Magnuson requires stocks to be rebuilt as quickly as possible, but in most cases not to exceed 10 years. If folks were following the striped bass conversation as well, one of the contrasts there is that it also requires rebuilding plans to be put in place within 2 years. So thinking about quick action once you figure out there's a problem, trying to get a stock back on an upward trajectory. So those are some of the key core tenets of MSA and some of the elements of the law that we really support and try to reinforce wherever we can.
So interstate management framework, and this is the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. It is not a council. The commission was developed in World War II to feed the country when we really had pretty serious concerns about that. So it is an interstate compact that is not held to the same management requirements as a council under the Magnuson-Stevens Act. It manages 27 nearshore species, so non-federal waters. Some of the species that may resonate with this crowd, menhaden, key forage species, building block of the entire coast. Everything that swims in the water eats a menhaden at some point in its life cycle. Striped bass, weak fish. They co-manage bluefish. For me, a little bit southern from here, spot, croaker, things that are also part of the forage basin and also that we like to catch. It is a one state, one vote at the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. There are 3 commissioners from each state. One is going to be the fisheries director of the state. One is a legislative proxy. So the state legislature, one member of that legislature is given the responsibility to appoint a person from the public to represent that office. And the kicker with the commission is it is not subject to litigation. So when a council breaks a rule, one of their rules under Magnuson, there are groups that are very good at what they do, and they will sue the council to correct the issue. As Willie brought the example for the rebuilding plan for striped bass, that stock assessment, the last data for that was 2017. It was accepted in 2018 by the Striped Bass Management Board, and there's no rebuilding plan in place. And it's 2022. And according to their rules, they should have started a rebuilding plan in 2019, and striped bass should be rebuilt by 2029. And we just won the fight on May 4th, folks, 2022, and no rebuilding plan has been established. And you're talking about the #1 most important fish on the East Coast, those 26 million trips. Everything else pales in comparison. And to not address these issues with striped bass swiftly really shows a weakness at the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. And with flexibility versus consistency, you start hearing things from other recreational fishing groups that flexibility is really important in management. And for us, flexibility is a 4-letter word. Accountability is really important in management to us. Consistency is really important in management to us. There's so many holes in fishery science that a lot of it is our fault. Being flexible does not really line up with our risk-averse way of approaching fisheries management. So the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission kind of touts this flexibility. I would say sometimes they flaunt it. And I think we're kind of a voice in the darkness that says we don't want it, right? We don't want flexibility. I want to know if the fish are going to be there next year. My guides want to know if it's worth investing $50,000 in new motors. Are the fish going to be around for 3 or 4 years, and am I going to see a net positive from that investment? We really can't run our businesses like other industries would run a business, because it's really hard for our members to project what it's going to look like 2 or 3 years from now. You know, prime example is our president. John built his business on striped bass. That's what he was known for forever. And now a huge part of his time, he had to shift the boats that he used, his business model, everything, and he's off the coast. He's off the coast fishing for tuna most of the time, and he was able to make those decisions. But we need that consistency. We don't need flexibility. So rules of engagement.
Is that me? All right, sounds good. And this is our last slide, and I think we'll be ready to take questions after this. So if folks want to start thinking of some questions, we'll be all ears. And so, yeah, this is, I think, what Tony was referring to earlier in terms of being on the other side a little bit. And it's important when you think about rules of engagement and thinking about working with managers. You know, there's a lot of different audiences. It depends on what specific issue you're working on. So in this picture here, this is Tony and John with Congressman Jared Huffman, who's been leading the charge largely for reauthorization of the Madison-Stevens Act in the current Congress. You know, you might also be dealing with commissioners at the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. You might be dealing with council members at the Regional Management Council, one of the regional management councils, or any other number of various entities where you might be dealing with decision makers. And so it's important, I would say, first and foremost, to establish relationships. And that can mean a lot of different things, depending on who you are and kind of what your comfort level is. I think, you know, creating a dialogue and sustaining a dialogue is a really important part of getting the work done. Certainly, submitting a public comment on a one-off issue to a fishery management plan coordinator is something. But being able to have a conversation with, as Will often does, for example, working with fishery management plan coordinators at the Mid-Atlantic Council on certain issues that we're engaged in, and kind of getting that inside track and really getting a sense of what's coming up, you know, what are the off-the-record conversations that are happening that we need to be aware of to have the most impact. And so I think that's a really important element of understanding how to be an effective advocate, and kind of understanding what's going on their side, and understanding what their level of familiarity or comfort or kind of own outlook is. So when I was working on the Hill, you know, I'm a fish guy. I cared about fisheries. I cared about Magnuson, and I wanted to learn more. You might be dealing with somebody else who's a year out of college and works on an entire energy and environment portfolio for a senator or a congressman, and doesn't know anything about fisheries. So understanding who your audience is and how you need to communicate and kind of meet them where they are is another really important element to that.
The last thing I'll say, I put in all caps on the bottom, become a trusted resource. So you know everything's going right. Like, the biggest indicator that we have in the job that we're doing is if a Hill staffer contacts us and says, hey, what's going on with this? And what I mean by that is sometimes there's something going on the Hill. The member of Congress walks in, it's Willie's portfolio, Willie's the fish guy, and all of a sudden, wham, something goes on the desk, and they said, you have 30 minutes to review this. There's a vote. There's going to be a floor vote. My boss is running off to go place the vote. What should I do? And you get a panicked phone call from that staffer saying, do you know anything about this? We need your advice. And you're like, wow, we did it. You know, we're now in a position where they trust us, and they understand that we're not just advocating for what we want or our agenda, but we're going to look out for them when it's their job, it's their responsibility, and we're going to be there for them to give them the information that they need to make the right decision. That's what we mean by trusted resource, and that takes time. and it takes a lot of effort and it takes integrity, but we do have that relationship with some people, and that for us, that is the end game, to be in that position. And like Willie said, it's not just for Hill staff. Maybe that's like kind of the top of the food chain, but there's a lot of small decisions that are made along the way at different levels of the process. And you know, we just want folks in those positions to say, you know what, I'm going to call Willie or Tony, and I'm going to figure out what's going on with this, and I can go to my boss, and I know that I'm covered and I'm okay. That's the end game in everything that we do. So I imagine folks have probably heard enough of us for now, so we're gonna end it there and move to some fresh faces up here in a minute. But while we're making that transition, if anybody has any questions, just raise your hand, and I think Austin will come around with a
with
microphone. And if we can be helpful in any way, or you didn't understand something that we said, please raise your hand. And if nobody has any questions, that's fine too. I think there's a hand in the back, Austin.
Thank you, guys. I was actually just wondering, well, so there's obviously this issue of the data in fisheries science having this kind of lag time and being a little bit reactive, and trying to be more proactive is obviously something to strive for. And I was wondering if maybe you could speak organizationally to like what, at a high level, how do you guys kind of rationalize that? And then as anglers, how can we kind of rationalize it in a useful way, and affect change in a more proactive way?
I'm going to let Willie answer that, but that's a great question. I mean, that is like, whew, man, bullseye.
And I think there are a couple of different ways to kind of answer it. And I think there's the management piece, and there's also kind of the outreach and communications piece, right? Because I think that can lead to folks getting frustrated with management when the data they're seeing is not necessarily catching up at the same pace. So I think on the management side, I would say our philosophy there is, if we don't know, let's be more cautious, and let's, again, if we want to have stability, let's do that in a way that minimizes our risk. So I think this is back to Tony's point of, if we have evidence that we're catching more fish, or that the stock is doing much better, as opposed to ratcheting it up as highly as we can and reducing the margin of error, let's keep our margin of error pretty substantial so that we're not going to risk overshooting that. So that's kind of, I think, our general philosophy with that. As far as it goes with communicating that frustration to recreational folks, which we have to deal with a lot, it happens all the time, you know, whether it's because of real-time data or whether it's because of a species that we don't typically hear about with recreational data. And Atlantic mackerel is a great example of a species we're dealing with right now with that. I think, you know, one important part of that is, to communicate what we do and what we don't know, and to show, you know, just because for example, for the Marine Recreational Information Program for MRIP, just because the numbers for private recreational anglers in one state during, you know, the summertime might have a large margin of error, a large percent standard error. If you aggregate over a larger area, that might not be the case. So trying to, you know, to where you can communicate some of that complexity. And then I think also demonstrating the challenges in recreational data and saying, this is an imperfect system. Would you like to be part of the solution? Because there are a lot of efforts that are out there. We're working on an effort right now to improve data collection in the bluefin tuna fishery, for example. And so I think trying to educate folks in a way that they can also be part of the solution, in addition to understanding the problem, is a good way to move forward.
I'll just follow up and say that I'm not sure that we'll ever have like that real-time data that you mentioned, but by using a fishery, like Willie said, we're doing some science on bluefin tuna reporting. And that's a much smaller fishery. There's much less anglers participating in that. And if we can learn from that and apply that to the broader fisheries like striped bass and bluefish, you know, another way to put it is, we don't have anywhere to go but up with rec data collection. So the bar isn't like super high. I don't know if it'll ever get to real time, but we can do way better than what we're doing. And I really appreciate your question, man. It was spot on, and thank you for asking that.
For those who need water to breathe, Costa sunglasses.